Cannibal facts that'll eat at you for days. Part 2. 71-year-old Tamara Samsonova murdered and ate at least 11 people and kept a diary detailing her crimes. She's been dubbed the Granny Ripper, and this CCTV footage shows her carrying the head of one of her victims in a saucepan. In 2008, a man on a packed Greyhound bus named Vince Lee killed and beheaded another 22-year-old passenger. He proceeded to dismember and eat his body in front of the other people on the bus. In 2008, Joe Matheny was sentenced to death after murdering 8 people, turning their meat into hamburgers, and selling them to unsuspecting customers. This photo shows the survivors of the 1972 Andes plane crash. The passengers resorted to cannibalism to survive 72 days in the snow. If you look closely at the ground, you'll see a human spine picked clean next to the guy on the right. In 1928, Albert Fish met up with his friend with the intention of killing and eating him. However, when he was introduced to the guy's 10-year-old sister Grace, he decided to eat her instead. After, he sent a letter to their parents saying that she tasted sweet and tender.
Drawings done by serial killers.
Run, rabbit, run, rabbit,
Run, run, run,
run, rabbit, run, rabbit.
run, run, run. Burn.
The world's most dangerous serial killer iceberg. This picture contains a list of serial killers from the least disturbing to the most. With all of this talk going on about Jeffrey Dahmer, I thought it would be interesting to go over a couple serial killer cases that the media didn't even want you to see. As always, the disturbing details are posted in the Discord in the bio. This is Dennis Nilsen, or also known as the Kindly Killer. The first victim of Dennis was a 14-year-old boy named Stephen Holmes, who he met at a local pub. He invited Stephen to his new house and he wanted to drink together in order to celebrate the new year. The two eventually drank themselves to sleep, but when Dennis woke up in the morning, he realized that Stephen was still sleeping. Fearing that Stephen would leave him, he strangled him and then drowned him in a bucket that was in the kitchen. He then took his camera out and started taking pictures of the boy, and the most disturbing part about this is he would set the boy's body up to watch television with him. Then once the show was finished, he would take the boy, wrap him back up in the plastic bags, and stick him under the floorboard. Eventually, once the body started to decompose, he would then boil the hands, head, and feet, and everything else he would flush down the toilet. Dennis ended up murdering at least 12 people within a span of 5 years. If you want to see some more disturbing details about this case, click the link in the bio to join the Discord, and make sure to like and follow for part 2 tomorrow.
How famous serial killers die.
Honey, don't you love me? And you know it makes me sad.
It's just a cigarette like you always used to do.
I was different then. I don't need them to be cool.
This man has just rose from the dead. Honestly, I can't believe I'm reading this. You may have seen the famous Netflix show Tiger King, you know, about this guy and the woman, Carol Baskin. And literally back in 2020 there was this whole meme on TikTok about Carol Baskin killing her husband and whatever, because he had been missing for like 30 years. Now, her husband was last seen in 1997, and as of 2002 he was actually pronounced officially dead, because no one knew where he was. And the whole rumour, of course, was that Carol Baskin killed him and fed him to the tigers. It has just come out. The CEA have just come out saying they have found him alive in Costa Rica. What's he doing out there? Yep, and if you remember, Carol said that he ran off with like $1 million and went away. That's what she said happened to him. And maybe that did happen because he's just been found alive in Costa Rica. So yeah. But there's not been any photos shown of him yet. For a case so big and popular as this, I'm struggling to see why. But we'll see. Let me know in the comments down below what you think.
Minutes before Audrey Hale opened fire at the Covenant School, she messaged one of her friends to warn her. Audrey messaged Averyana Patton, who was a former basketball teammate, and told her that she was going to take her life and that something bad was going to happen. Averyana quickly called the suicide prevention hotline, but then they told her to call police. Then police told Averyana to call the non-emergency number, and at this point, it was 10:14 a.m. At 10:15 a.m., Audrey had already entered the building and opened fire. Averyana explains that no one ever came back to the phone, and she got a phone call back an hour later. Averyana had no idea that the person involved in the shooting was her friend who contacted her in the morning. It's been said that Audrey was under care for an emotional disorder, but she was still able to legally buy 7 weapons. On the morning of the shooting, Audrey was seen by her parents leaving the house with a red backpack, and they asked her what was in it, but she brushed off the question. The victims were Catherine Coons, who was the head of the school, Mike Hill, who was the school custodian, Cynthia Peak, who was a substitute teacher. The other 3 victims are 9 years old, one of them being 9-year-old Hallie Scruggs, who is actually the daughter of the pastor of the school. The other victim was William Kinney and 9-year-old Evelyn Dykehouse.
Did you know that Chris Watts, the man who killed his entire family in 2018, has seen his daughter's spirit in his jail cell? In the book Letters from Christopher, author Sherilyn Cattle claims that she received a letter from Chris where he details seeing his daughter in a dream in his jail cell. In this dream, he claims to have seen his daughter Cece dancing on the chair next to his bed in the cell. And he claims that while he saw her dancing in the jail cell, the folders and other items he had sitting there started to move by themselves. In the same book, he also claims to have talked to his dead wife, who he murdered, on the phone from prison. There are multiple articles talking about this happening online, and it's also reported that the only things he's allowed to have in his cell are photos of his family and a Bible. He's also stated in the past that he hopes to be reconnected with his family one day, but I don't know if that's going to happen. If you want to hear more of the paranormal claims surrounding the Watts murders, go listen to my podcast, Murder in America. Our episode is 1 hour and 20 minutes long, and we go super in depth in the case file. And I guarantee if you listen to our podcast, you'll learn new things that you've never heard or seen before.
Did you know that on the morning of September 11th, when United 93 took off, it was missing its 5th hijacker, who was later believed to be Mohammed Al-Qahtani, who tried to enter the country on August 4th, 2001 at the Orlando International Airport. Jose Melendez-Perez was his immigration officer who questioned him for over 90 minutes. During that time, Jose said that Al-Qahtani could provide him no information on where he was staying, couldn't give a reason for his travel in the United States, and had no return flight home. His irate attitude while being questioned by Jose also set off red flags, and Jose began to believe that he'd been trained by a military. After those 90 minutes, Al-Qahtani was refused entry to the United States on a technicality. As he boarded his flight back to Dubai, he turned around to officials and said, "I'll be back," in perfect English after telling him he only knew how to speak Arabic, and working with a translator all through his interrogation. And during his interrogation, he would let it slip that someone was waiting for him upstairs at the MCO airport, but then changed his story and said no, they weren't. Later credit card records would show that Mohammed Atta, the lead terrorist of the 9/11 attacks, was at the MCO airport that day. We've gone through this and so much more over on Deep Diving to Lolios.
Authorities speculate that Idaho killer Brian Kohberger's motive for murder ultimately came down to his desire to commit the perfect crime. The perfect crime is defined as one that remains unsolved not because of the incompetency of the investigation, but because of the cleverness and skill of the criminal. Few cases in American history echo the portrayal of this narcissistic motive more than that of killer couple Nathan Leopold and Richard Loeb. Famous filmmaker Alfred Hitchcock was so intrigued by this case that he based one of his films on the story, Rope. It was Hitchcock's first and only film that featured a homosexual partnership, which for 1948 was pretty scandalous. During the filming, everyone on set allegedly referred to homosexuality as it. And like the film, the real story involves 2 very privileged individuals who murder for sport. Leopold and Loeb were a couple of teenagers in the 1920s from Chicago who came from wealthy families with high social standing. Both were certifiable geniuses, though Leopold was intellectually more gifted with an IQ ranging between 200 and 220, and he spoke 9 languages. Leopold found it difficult to make friends and was especially sensitive to the opinions of others and to their criticism. As a defense, he assumed the attitude of indifference and superiority to others. Loeb reportedly had a genius IQ of 160, and by contrast, was skillful socially and skipped several grades. The result was that Loeb was emotionally behind in his development and grew up too fast, drinking alcohol with his classmates and having sexual relations while feeling completely disconnected and isolated from others. Leopold and Loeb had a history of disobeying authorities without any legal consequences, and both men lived lives consisting of extreme fantasy. The two were an excellent match psychologically. The brilliant but socially inept Leopold was enthralled by the handsome and vivacious Loeb, who in turn found an excellent alter ego for his fantasy world. Their relationship soon became sexually intimate, and within a year of meeting each other, the two had decided to carry out the perfect crime, both for the thrill of it and to prove their superiority. Leopold had read Friedrich Nietzsche and decided that he and Loeb embodied what the philosopher called the Übermensch, or Superman, who was literally above man. Loeb specifically wanted to commit a crime that would set all of Chicago talking, and the term that originated from the crime they committed was thrill kill. Check out part 2 to hear the details.
This is Mr. Swirl, one of the worst pedophiles in world history. And let me tell you, this story is really disturbing, so viewer discretion is advised. So this is Mr. Swirlface himself, Christopher Paul Neal. He was born in Canada in 1975. So Christopher had a pretty unremarkable childhood, but it should be stated here that he wanted to become a Catholic priest. But after the seminary denied him because he wasn't properly qualified, he decided to become a teacher instead. So Christopher eventually moved out of Canada. He moved to South Korea. That's where he was employed as a teacher. And suddenly, all of these images of CP started circulating around the internet. Christopher appeared in over 200 images of CP that he produced himself. And in every photo that he produced, he always put this swirly effect over his face, thinking that it would obscure his identity. Well, eventually German computer experts were able to unswirl the image. They produced this image to the left, and a number of people who knew Christopher contacted Interpol and told them, this is that guy. So once he was identified, Christopher fled to Thailand. That's where he decided he would make his great getaway. And while he was living in Thailand, he employed the services of a young boy who would go out to local internet cafes and bring Christopher other young boys that he would abuse and take photos of. But this didn't last long and obviously didn't work out for Christopher. In the year 2007, towards the end of the year, he was finally arrested by the Thai police. There's nothing that brings me more joy than seeing all these officers around this guy. And one thing that should be noted about Christopher is his unrepentant nature when he's photographed. You'll see what I mean. Pictures like these were taken by the press when he was finally arrested and brought to justice. So in Thailand, Christopher was sentenced to 39 months in prison and he was handed a $1,700 plus fine. But he later admitted to the crime, he was eventually released, and then he returned to Canada. Upon his return to Canada, he was immediately arrested at the Vancouver International Airport. Now, while Christopher was in Canada, CP was found on his phone and laptop. He was sentenced to a number of years in prison. But in March of 2017, Christopher was released from prison, and he now lives in Vancouver somewhere, according to the internet. That's right, Mr. Swirlyface is currently out on the streets. I didn't know this. I think this is an absolute injustice to all the victims of this guy. This is absolutely a horrific story, and I cannot believe he's not serving more time for appearing in over 200 images of CP. It's crazy. But yeah, let me know below. Do you think this guy should still be in prison? I'm also going to be starting a true crime series talking about murders, conspiracies, all of the above on my YouTube channel, The Paranormal Files, so go subscribe if you don't already. But yeah, this story is unbelievable and sickening.
The co-founder of Salt Life was recently sentenced for the killing of his girlfriend. The man I'm about to talk about is literally the reason you see all of these stickers. He coined the term Salt Life and co-founded the company. In October of 2020, 54-year-old Michael Hutto booked a room at an oceanfront resort on Singer Island. And with him was his 18-year-old girlfriend, Laura Grace Duncan, who had just graduated from high school months prior. After spending time at the beach, the couple went back to the hotel room. According to Michael, they were playing around and started to pretend to shoot each other with finger guns. Then Michael pulled out a real gun. He said Grace was sitting on the bathroom counter when he pointed the gun at her and it went off. He claimed it was an accident. Instead of calling 911, Michael left with the weapon and a backpack, while Grace was left bleeding to death on the bathroom floor. He also left his wallet and ID behind. He then drove 280 miles to a gas station. He reportedly walked in and asked the attendant for help. He was also twitching, crying, and making delusional comments, and his eyes were rolling into the back of his head. Michael was taken to the hospital for a reported overdose. By the following morning, Grace's parents hadn't heard from her for 48 hours. And on the morning of the 29th, Grace's father asked for a welfare check. He tracked her phone to the hotel. Even from down the hallway, the police could tell that there was a decomposing body inside of that hotel room, because Grace had been left there for hours and hours. She was fatally shot in the stomach by Michael. When police went back to the hospital to talk to Michael, he immediately started confessing. He said, "Oh my God, I think I hurt my Gracie." He was arrested the next day after being discharged from the hospital for manslaughter and a weapons violation. So you're probably wondering how an 18-year-old girl and a man in his mid-50s got into a relationship. Michael was married with 4 children when he met Grace at a gym where she worked. I don't know how long the relationship had been going on by October of 2020, but on the 25th, she texted her parents that she and Michael were traveling to meet his friends. And the point of that was those friends could help them start a business. Grace's parents reported her missing the next day. Officers came to their house, and Grace called her parents while they were there. Over the phone, she reportedly said that everything was fine, but her parents said she sounded drugged and vulnerable. Grace called her parents one last time to say that they were headed for the Keys, and it would be just a couple days later that she would be found deceased in Michael's hotel room. Last week, Michael pleaded guilty to manslaughter, and he was sentenced to 12 years in prison.
2 moms chatting at a water park were able to solve a 30-year-old cold case. On Thanksgiving weekend 1989, a teenager named Mandy Stavik went on a jog with her German Shepherd in Acme, Washington. The dog came back, but she didn't. And sadly, her body was found 3 days later on the bank of a nearby river. Because she was in the water, a lot of the evidence had been washed off, but police were able to pull male DNA from her. At the time, there were no matches in the system, and Mandy's murder would go unsolved for 3 decades. Heather Backstrom and Marilee Anderson were among a group of moms who had begun gossiping while their kids played together at the water park. One of the moms brought up an unsolved murder in their hometown of Acme. This is when Heather blurted out that she thinks she knew who did it, and Marilee said she did too. It turns out that both of them had independent, creepy experiences with the same man, Tim Bass. One day, Tim Bass knocked on Marilee's door and asked to use the phone. This was before the time of cell phones, so it wasn't completely unusual. But Marilee's phone volume was up loud enough to know that he wasn't actually having a conversation on the phone. And when he hung up, he started telling Marilee about how he was secretly in love with her and how he would drive past her house every day and watch her in the yard. She threatened to call the police, and thankfully Tim left without incident. Meanwhile, Heather caught a ride from her friend one day who happened to also be friends with Tim. Since there was no back seat in his truck, she sat in the middle console with the friend driving and then Tim Bass sitting in the passenger seat. Tim Bass was aggressively flirting with her, and she found this really creepy since she was just 15 and he was 21. The 2 women went to the police with the suspicion that Tim Bass was the one who killed Mandy. The police then went to his manager at the local bakery, who was more than happy to help them collect a DNA sample. She grabbed his used Coke can out of the trash, and the police tested the DNA taken from the lip of the can against the DNA that was found on Mandy's body. And it was a match. It made no sense that Tim Bass's DNA would be on Mandy unless he was the one who killed her. At his trial, Tim Bass, who was now 51, was sentenced to 27 years in prison. Even when a case goes unsolved for decades, there's still hope. Comment any other cases you want me to cover down below.